Hi, welcome back to my channel, Bella here. Sometimes I would hear my students say that because they can't speak Chinese that well, their English is also not going to be good. Now the question is, does our Chinese affect our English speaking? And my answer is not necessarily. And there are a few things I want you to think about as well. First is the grammatical rules in English and those in Chinese. As we all know, after spending years and years learning English grammar, that the rules are very different between the two languages. Sometimes the same meaning should be delivered in one way in Chinese needs to be said in a completely different way in English. So not being able to organize your sentences that well in Chinese doesn't necessarily mean that you can't speak perfectly correct sentences in English. And a lot of times, the sentence order is also very different between Chinese and English, especially when we're trying to translate an idea from Chinese to English word for word, we often make mistakes. And another thing I want you to think about too is that when we speak English, there is going to be a lot more emphasis on the structure in our speaking. Sometimes when we're speaking Chinese, our ideas may sound very well organized and logical, but when we translate them into English, they may turn out to be very chaotic and very confusing to our listeners. Once again, that's due to the differences in these two languages. In English, especially when we have to give a lengthy explanation or description of something, we need to be very organized with our ideas. For example, if we're trying to give an opinion on a particular topic, there is a particular structure we need to follow in order to make sure that our listeners are going to follow us the whole time. So we need to start with stating our opinion, what that is. There should be no beating around the bushes with that. We should be as straightforward as possible. And then we need to let our listeners know that we're now moving on to our reasons for that. So often we use structures like, I feel this way for a few reasons, or there are a few reasons why this is the case. So there are these structural cues that we often give in English in order to outline what we're going to talk about. Not only will that help us present a well-structured content, it will also allow our listeners to understand us all the time. Because once we start to get too much into our head and start talking about whatever that's come across our head, things can get quite confusing and ideas can get quite scattered. So it would be very challenging for our listeners or the person we're having a conversation with to grasp our meanings. And the result of that is that we lost our listeners or the conversation could not go on. So that's one of the major differences I find between English and Chinese. And last but not least, I find often when I try to express myself in English, I need to be a lot more direct and I need to get to my point. And that's why when we listen to native speakers talking about basically anything, even in some formal situations, like when they're giving a speech or when they are doing a presentation in a professional setting, they always stick with straightforward, simple sentence structures because that's the most concise way to get our points across. I remember when I was in university, one of our professors mentioned the ABC principle when we are communicating in English. ABC stand for accurate, brief, and concise. And that's exactly what a good spoken English should sound like. And that will also explain sometimes when we're focusing too much on translating everything from Chinese to English, when we're expressing ourselves in the English language, that we sound very wordy and very textbookish. And it would always give people a very distant feeling, like we don't want to get personal with others, or we're trying to keep some distance between us and the people that we are talking to. So I don't really think that's the best way to represent ourselves. And that's most of the time not truly who we are. For example, in Chinese, we may say something like, oh, doing that thing gives me the feeling of. And then when we're trying to express that idea in English, we say it exactly like that. But if you pay attention to how native speakers express similar meanings, Instead of saying that something gives them the feeling of, they usually just say doing something makes them feel, or they feel a certain way about something. For example, running makes me feel energetic, or I feel energetic when I'm running. Instead of trying to put together a long and complicated and redundant sentence such as, running gives me the feeling of having a lot of energy. And here's another example. If I want to describe the same thing, for example, I want to describe how beneficial running is. So when you're translating from Chinese, you might say something like, it provides the benefits for, like our physical and mental health. But instead of using the phrase provide the benefits for, which can be wordy sometimes, we can simply say running benefits our physical and mental health. So instead of using a phrase, we can simply use the word benefit as the verb to complete our sentences. So to go back to my point, not being able to speak Chinese very well, or you didn't really achieve good grades in your Chinese when you were at school, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to speak English well. Again, because of the differences between the two languages and the specific practices that are required of you in order to improve your English speaking, it is very likely for you to speak native-like English despite the unsatisfactory use of the Chinese language.